Good morning. Thanks for coming. My caffeine level is about where it should be, so I think we're okay. I put together a little presentation and I wrote a script. I've never done this before, so I'm pretty anxious, but I think you guys are forgiving, so I'm really happy to be asked to do this. I'm happy to have something else to do at this time on a weekday other than sit behind a computer in my pajamas. I want to thank CreativeMornings, the Hill House, the sponsors. MailChimp is one of the sponsors, and Tiny Letter is what makes Eat That Read This possible. So thank you, MailChimp and Tiny Letter. I'm Adam. I'm 29 and a half years old, which I thought was relevant because the theme is time. Which, thank you to the Edmonton chapter for a very easy topic. Time is, like fucking crazy because the only way we can really understand it is things changing. So it's this like super abstract concept that we just have to like grow bad at seeing, how it affects us and the world. So anyway, my presentation kind of revolves around the concept of time, maybe not, and you can ask me to explain better afterwards because we'll have a little Q&A. But so most every weekday, I wake up, I go to the bathroom, I take the dogs out so they can go to the bathroom. I make coffee, and then I sit down to flip through, ideally, every single web article about Pittsburgh that's been published over the last 24 hours. I sift through all this news, and I compile a roughly 2,500-word e-newsletter that gets sent to thousands of Pittsburghers in boxes around lunchtime. And that's why I call it Eat That, Read This, or Eat This, Read That. Either one is fine, because it's kind of a complicated name. It's a little counterintuitive. Sometimes I write commentary about the news, and at the very least, I like to connect the story of the day to some kind of relevant context. But what I'm really doing is curating the work of others. I guess that's a skill of its own, but it does feel a bit rich to call yourself a curator when I'm like going commando in sweatpants and pajamas. So I wanted to show you guys what that work looks like from my end. You see the finished result, 12:30 or 1 if I'm like particularly hungover, whatever that day. So it takes a number of hours, but I've sped it up because the talk is only supposed to be 20 minutes. Some techno for you. then I hit send. So why do I do this? Sesame Spinelli from Pittsburgh 80s art punk band The Dykes put it best. I'm bored. I want to improve things for everyone. I want Pittsburgh to be fun. These are some stills with a little bit of editing from a must-watch 1980 documentary by Stephanie Barrows. You might have caught it at the Carnegie Museum a little while ago. It's called Debt Begins at 20, and it's a 1980 documentary about this very specific scene in a specific time and place. A precious time capsule, as W.T. Koltek at WYEP said. So check it out, and I can give you a link if you want to see it. I don't know if you can see, that's me up there, but I moved here with my partner Matt 5 and some change years ago. Why did I leave Brooklyn? It's a question that I get asked a lot, because it's just a conversation that people are having in Pittsburgh. Why do people come to Pittsburgh? This Brooklyn web magazine called Brooklyn Based asked me the question most recently, and every time I get asked the question, I come up with some different answer, and it's not like, it's not accurate, but I just don't even know myself the right answer. So when Brooklyn Based asked me, I just said something about the weather or something, because I like winter and I hate summer in New York. And I've made a lot of friends in Pittsburgh. I wish there had been something like Eat That, Read This for me when I first moved to Pittsburgh. As an outsider, Pittsburgh can be a tough nut to crack. Pittsburgh is small, and it's a place that you can definitely wrap your arms around, as I like to say. But I think Pittsburgh's true mass, its heft, isn't horizontal, it's vertical. It's a layering of history and of time. Got the theme. I love the news, I love media, and I love weird shit, and so I love history. Here is an example of a vertical layering of history. This happened on McKnight Road some months back, if you're not familiar. And I feel a little bad laughing at the plight of this woman in her car, because that is like really scary. But I love the news. When I was a kid, I devoured fiction books. Watership Down, The Animorphs, C.S. Lewis. I was a fantasy fiction kid. But I also realized how to appreciate nonfiction for its own kind of storytelling. And history fulfilled two strong desires in me. First, it had the power to reveal truths about the world and about humanity, which is something that I crave. And second, I grew up out in the country, Frederick County, Maryland. So I did my fair share of tree forts and crayfish hunting and building teepees and hanging out on the railroad tracks. But really, I wasn't what you would call an outdoor kid. So history was my way of digging in the dirt, so to speak. This is a picture of our backyard, which we've been renovating like for the last 7 months. This is, what you see here is where a wood shop used to be. The house that we bought in Lawrenceville before we moved in was one family's home from the beginning to the end. It was the Stokan family, who were Croatian. And the patriarch of the Stokan family was a carpenter, actually, for the city of Pittsburgh. So in the backyard, there was a pretty impressive workshop, wood shop, though it was pretty decrepit. And we're not handy, and we wanted the space. So we got rid of the workshop. That's Sam inspecting the work, our contractor. Here you can see the layers of brick underneath the top layer of cement in the alley behind our house, a sort of sedimentary foundation. We pulled up the concrete slab in the back as well, that we'll be standing on, and still I'm finding tons of old glass pieces in the dirt. They're not super valuable or historic or whatever, but it keeps coming up, I mean, literally. So anyway, this past week, I've been doing a lot of reading about Pittsburgh's glass history. Before Pittsburgh was a steel town, it was a glass town. Here's the Heinz History Center's Andy Masick on KQV.
Here's another Pittsburgh history event with Senator John Heinz Pittsburgh Regional History Center. Here's the president and CEO of the Heinz History Center, Andy Masick.
When the Statue of Liberty underwent torch-to-toe restoration for the nation's bicentennial in 1976, locally based Traco crafted the 25 windows for its crown with glass 4 times stronger than conventional glass. Western Pennsylvania companies also produced the glass used as tiles in the Holland and Lincoln tunnels in New York City, the searchlights of the Panama Canal, and the tableware for Presidents Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Hoover, and Roosevelt. By the 1880s, Pittsburgh produced 30% of the nation's glass, and by 1920, an astonishing 80% of the nation's glass production occurred in Western Pennsylvania and the Ohio Valley. With access to a mix of critical resources, rivers and transportation, raw materials, and labor, Pittsburgh became home to major glass companies, including giant Pittsburgh Plate Glass, today's PPG. Yes, before Pittsburgh was known as an iron and steel town, it was the city of glass.
That was today's Pittsburgh history.
Thank you, KQV and Andy Masick. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to James O'Hara. Quartermaster General James O'Hara is one of Pittsburgh's earliest founding fathers, one of the biggies. He was born in County Mayo, Ireland, which I like because it reminds me of Mayo, and I really like Mayo. According to George Thornton Fleming's History of Pittsburgh and Environs, O'Hara's motto, like the Klan, his family's motto was try. He joined the British Army, and by 1773, he had gotten into the trading business out here in Pittsburgh on the frontier. He spoke English and French. He had studied in France, but he also picked up some Indian dialects, and so he was like a really good businessman. And then he started buying up land. He got really into building up Pittsburgh. In his obituary published when he died in 1819, it read, "Through the introduction of his glass, brewery, and other businesses, and in the buildings he erected, he almost created a city himself." By the way, Quartermaster General James O'Hara is Mary Shenley's maternal grandfather, and Shenley inherited a ton of his land, like what's today Shenley Park, the Fort Pitt Block House, the land where the Carnegie Museum and the library are, etc. Also, his grandson was William Darlington, whose Darlington Memorial Library is an awesome trove of Pittsburgh history, and I used to work in the Humanities Center in the Cathedral of Learning, where his library used to be. Also, his granddaughter married Elizabeth, it was her name. She married the son of Ebenezer Denny, who was Pittsburgh's first mayor. So anyway, O'Hara is like a big guy in Pittsburgh history. And he had a bunch of irons in the fire, so to speak. So in 1797, he finished construction of the Pittsburgh Glass Works, the first glass factory in Pittsburgh, in collaboration with Major Isaac Craig, who sounds pretty hot, but I couldn't find any photos. So anyway. An advertisement in the Pittsburgh Gazette around that time. The Gazette was founded in 1786, the first newspaper west of the Alleghenies, and that tag comes up a lot when you read about Pittsburgh history, the first X west of the Alleghenies. So the Pittsburgh Gazette had this to say about O'Hara's factory, and I'll condense this lightly for our purposes. "The proprietors of the Pittsburgh Glass Works, having procured a sufficient number of the most approved European glass manufacturers, and having on hand a large stock of the best materials, on which the workmen are now employed, have the pleasure of assuring the public that window glass of superior quality and of any size from 7 by 9 to 8 by 24 inches, carefully packed in boxes containing 100 feet each, may be had at the shortest notice. Glass of large sizes for other purposes may also be had, such as for pictures, coach glasses, clock faces, etc." It goes on and on. The ad mentions a sufficient number of the most approved European glass manufacturers, and when you consider William Peter Eichbaum, that's not just hyperbole. Eichbaum was a master glassman, the master glassman to Louis XVI. of France, but he fled to Philadelphia just before the Revolution, which was a really good call, because Louis XVI was guillotined in 1793. But by 1797, Eichbaum had been coaxed to relocate to Pittsburgh by O'Hara, and he was manning the first glassworks in town. The factory was located on the southern bank of the Ohio, not too far past the point, in an area called Scott's, and later Glass House Riffle. What is a riffle? A riffle is a naturally forming bar in the river, a buildup of stones or driftwood that can make river travel difficult. In fact, Meriwether Lewis had a run-in with some riffles locally, which he whined about in a letter that he wrote to President Jefferson in 1803, only a couple months into the Corps of Discovery expedition. That's the trip. He was heading to meet up with William Clark near Louisville, Kentucky. He had set off from Philly, came to Pittsburgh, to Wheeling, and once in Wheeling, he sat down to write this letter to Thomas Jefferson. He reported that he had to get out and carry his boat across the Ohio River riffles, even at one point finding himself, quote, compelled to hire horses or oxen from the neighboring farms and drag her over them. In fact, that very year, allegedly, the rivers were lower than anyone could remember, I read on lewis-clark.org. Probably frustrated at the slow going, Lewis actually then went ashore, just 3 miles down from Ohio, at the point, to hang out with some Mason friends, like the social, not like brick builders, Masons. He started showing off his fancy pneumatic rifle, allegedly, and he lent it to an onlooker to try out, but the man, quote, accidentally discharged it, firing a bullet into the crowd, and it pierced through a woman's hat. She fell to the ground, blood gushing from her temple. She survived as the wound wasn't that serious, luckily, and the expedition continued. Anyway, back to glass. In this lithograph from Harper's, shared by the Corning Museum in New York, men in an unidentified Pittsburgh glass foundry are pressing and bottoming goblets. Pittsburgh's second glass works was built across the way from Glass House Riffle in Manchester in 1800. By the time the third glass works was built in 1808, Pittsburgh's glass was being sold around the country and even in Mexico, newspapers at the time were saying. Over the course of the 19th century, glass factories popped up all along the rivers, from the south side to the north side, to downtown and the Strip, and of course in river towns all over the region. The names of Pittsburgh's early glass barons are probably pretty recognizable to everyone. O'Hara, Craig, Denny, Beeler, Hay, Lawrence, Whiteman, Dithridge, Agnew, Pitcairn, McKee. They litter the landscape like shards of old glass underneath my backyard workshop. But there's also a lot of names we don't know. The names of workers, men and children, young boys would work days on end, often through the nights, in these glass factories. In the Pittsburgh Survey, the legendary Progressive Era sociological survey of Pittsburgh, researchers share one story of a family that had sent their young son to work at a glass factory. Quote, the mother said that a great many underage boys were at work in this place, and that when the inspector came around, they ran and hid in the barrels and boxes, upon which the bosses immediately sat down. At the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, a man named George Alexander Macbeth won the very first medal ever given for specimens of optical glass. Macbeth's plant was one of the industrial glories of Pittsburgh, that's a quote, gaining a worldwide reputation for quality. And he opened several plants, merging with Thomas Evans Glass Company to become Macbeth Evans. They were the world's largest producer of lamp chimneys. Lamp chimneys are, like in those old-timey, like oil lights, they would be those like fluted glass fixtures. That's a lamp chimney. These aren't, I don't believe these are lamp chimneys, but I just thought they were really pretty. They're from a 1912 Macbeth Evans catalog. Click, okay. Macbeth Evans was also known for their Fresnel lenses. That's Fresnel, capitalized because it's a name. It's a lens that's rounded but sliced around into concentric rings to reduce spherical aberration. Up close, a Fresnel lens looks grooved like a vinyl record, but far away it looks like a gigantic insect face. In 1936, Macbeth Evans merged with Corning Glass, and they shared this trademark, the boy blowing the glass into the air. It was later used by Corning Glass for their branding. 1 year later, in 1937, Corning developed the Corning-Steuben block. Let's backtrack a tiny bit. In 1833, an Irish immigrant named William McCulley built the Phoenix Glass Works at 16th Street and Liberty in the Strip. It cranked out green and black bottles exclusively. It's recognized as the first bottles-only glass factory built west of the Alleghenies. McCulley also built the first factory of Glassblock, or brick glass, in Pittsburgh shortly after 1850. So the Corning-Steuben method, coming back to the 30s, basically it's a heat proofing of the two halves of Glassblock, and that's basically how they're still made today. So I sort of love Glassblock. Glassblock was one of the first architectural features that really grabbed my attention when I came to Pittsburgh. It's everywhere. It peeks up out of basements. I've been in buildings where the light hits a wall panel of Glassblock just right, and the hazy light is gorgeous. But it's unassuming, it's humble, it can be considered tacky. But it's a literal architectural element. It's a building block that lets in light. I could keep going, but I love Glassblock. And I learned after having created this whole brand identity for this web magazine that I'm launching, so do these Pittsburghers. The Glassblock is the name of a web magazine I'm planning on launching in collaboration with filmmaker, musician, artist, and textbook definition of polymath, Dave Bernabo. We launched a 30-day crowdfunding campaign to raise money to commission stories of Pittsburgh from writers and other kinds of artists. We hit our goal on Monday, and we had a celebration party at Spirit, and it's fucking awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Eat That, Read This has been truly a labor of love, but I'm also tired of my own voice. So what I'm really interested in is everyone else's voices, and this is really the impetus for the Glassblock, a platform to throw a spotlight on things that are happening in Pittsburgh that the existing media outlets aren't really doing the best job at. Stories told in people's own voices, stories told in ways that explore audio and video and other kinds of media, and stories for, from, of Pittsburgh. Thanks.